Good afternoon, everybody. Let's kill the snow. There we go. Thanks for joining the last live stream of 2023, which is all very exciting. I've already put stuff up for 2024, which we'll talk about later. But today is on the subject of, well, it's called bad light. I wouldn't necessarily say bad light, but suboptimal conditions where you need to do a little bit more work and tweaking to the image to get the best out of it. So we're looking at the HDR tools like highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, exposure tools. We'll talk a little bit about noise as well and how to mitigate that. Some local adjustments thrown in, mostly centered around style brushes. And that should take us, 45-50 minutes. If you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, welcome. Thanks for joining us there. You can also ask questions there. So just put your comments in the chat, and that will come through to me. I've also got Victor and Helen helping out as well. So if you see a response from someone other than me, that's right. JD, who just made a comment on YouTube, exposed to the right is more often not the correct way to expose. Totally agree, and I'm going to talk about that as well. If you are in our live streaming room where Helen and Victor are as well, you can ask a question in the Q&A tab. And that will just keep it separate from the chat so they can find it easier. If you don't want to ask questions, you can hide that, and that will give you a bit more space to see Capture One as well. So that's enough with the housekeeping side of things. Let's dive into Capture One. So I thought the first thing to talk about that would be useful is to just have a little recap on the difference between highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, because it's quite often misunderstood, sometimes not understood at all, and secondly, it's always good to have a refresher on these things. So if I bring out the histogram tool and we bring out the high dynamic range tool, we can actually, I'm not going to stick them together just yet. Let's hide our tools so we've got a bit more space on screen, and I'm going to make this histogram larger, which you can do. So if you want to see a bit more granularity, detail and everything into your histogram so you can really dig into the details, then that's also a good way to see it. So highlights, shadows, whites and blacks. Highlights and shadows, I imagine you probably understand, but white and black, it's a very similar name. What does it actually mean? Well, I've got this image here, which kind of has extremes of lighting, if you like. So we've got our man at the front enjoying his phone, sitting in shadows. Man at the back enjoying his lunch, sitting in the light, which is coming from the right-hand side. And then if you didn't know, this little orange line that sits on the histogram, that will pretty much show you exactly the tonal range. So if I move my cursor around, so this bump here is more than likely to be our towels on the right, like so. So we can see this spike here, is the brightest area, essentially. So if we were looking to edit this picture, we want to do a couple of things, probably. We want to recover some of the highlights, and we might want to look a little bit deeper into the shadows. But how I do that with the highlights, whites and blacks, let's actually have a look. So let's make this a bit bigger as well. So if I pull the highlights, and let's do extreme adjustments. So let's go all the way down to the left, like so, and look at what happens. So if I do before and after, which is a long press on the highlight tool, so we see before and after, like so, you can see our histogram. This part here has been squashed, compressed and pushed to the left-hand side. So then we've got, a reduction in the brightness, which we can see very clearly on these towels on the left-hand side. Let's reset that by double clicking. If we take our whites, and again, extreme adjustment, let's go all the way to the left, like so. If we do before and after, so that's before, after, like so, much less dramatic. So that spike, which we saw there, has pretty much been squished down. Whereas if you remember with the highlights, let's pull that across, a much broader range of the histogram has been affected. So if you think of the highlight slider and white slider, they're kind of doing the same thing, but the highlight slider has a broader effect on the top end of the histogram, whereas the white slider is just the very, very brightest points. So sometimes it can mean that, and this image is maybe not the best example, but sometimes it can mean that if you pull your highlights down, it's maybe making other areas of the picture too dark. It's not the effect you want. You just wanted to kill those highlights. And the white gives you that control. Because you'll see here, actually, even if I go all the way to -100, I think that's a fridge or a cylinder. I don't know. Whatever this thing is over here, that gets darker. The towels get darker. This wall over here has very little effect. If we do extreme highlights once more, then this actually gets a little bit darker. So you see before and after, before and after, and the change to the histogram is quite different. So white's the top end, highlights a little bit broader. Similar kind of story with shadows and blacks. So if we pull open the shadows fully, again, extreme adjustment, I would not edit like this. We can see the image brightens. If we look at our histogram once more, quite a big change between the extremes. So before and after, so all the darker tones have got pushed, the mid-tones towards this end have raised a little bit, and it's actually even made a slight bit of brightness difference on our top end there as well. So quite dramatic. Now I wouldn't suggest you go ahead and do that. You could say, wow, isn't my camera good? It has all this dynamic range that I can recover. Sure, but now you've lost all the atmosphere of the picture. Just because we can see into the shadows a number of stops doesn't mean that we should. So with great power comes great responsibility and so on. But let's open up those shadows again so you can see before and after. Let's do the same with the blacks. Again, extreme adjustment. Already you can see how different the histogram looks before and after. So if we look at the before on the blacks, kind of look at this area down here, you'll see opening up that black slider has affected pretty much just the bottom end, and this stuff hasn't moved to the extent that the shadow slider did. Quite a big difference. So it does mean that you can, really control the endpoints of the histogram how you would like. So if I was to edit this picture properly, then I would want to pull back my highlights and whites a little bit. I would open up my shadows a touch and maybe even go in the opposite direction. So kind of keeping that realism, if you like. Seeing, because no one actually wants to look at really burnt out highlights. It's very distracting. We'll have a look at another example in a second. Opening up the shadows, but still keeping, that tonal contrast, if you like. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions on those highlights and shadow sliders? No, I think we are okay. Good. All right. So another thing that I wanted to mention, which kind of relates very closely to this, let's just reset my workspace now that I've messed that up. Nice. Is brightness and exposure. So let's bring out the big guns. So let's bring out my histogram once more, bring out exposure, and we'll also bring out this as well. And let's hide the tools. Can make our histogram a little bit bigger again. And you can see, similar with this shot, there's this little tiny blip at the end here. So what could that be? So if we look at the bright sunlight down here, this is way off the scale. So if you look at our RGB values, kind of off the charts really, probably around, I don't know, here we're getting a bit closer to it, also maybe under his arm, maybe down here, but yeah, it's pretty bright there, but we've got a little bit of a bump here. So looking at this picture, forgetting about highlight, shadows and all that stuff, my first impression is that it's a little bit underexposed, so I might like to make it brighter. It's actually a little bit on the cool side, so I'm just going to warm it up a touch so it looks a little bit more realistic with the sun coming through the trees and so on. So let's do that. And then think about exposure versus brightness. So this is actually a really useful slider which I use a great deal because it can save you time in editing, I would say, and involves less, you know, sort of contra adjustments of sliders at times. So this is a little bit underexposed. So your first instinct is to make it brighter. So if we use the exposure and drag this up until I think probably something around there could be nice in terms of the overall exposure of the shot. However, if we look at our histogram now over here and paying attention to the picture, all that nice atmospheric smoke, gone, too bright. So then, of course, your next plan is to think, well, I need to bring those highlights back. So I'm going to counteract what I did with the exposure tool and bring my highlights and whites down to something acceptable. That works, no problem with that. However, you might like to also consider using the brightness slider, because the brightness slider does a similar thing, except whereas the exposure slider makes everything brighter, shadows get brighter, midtones get brighter, highlights get brighter, the brightness has a certain level of protection on the top end over here. So this little bump that we saw, if we bring up the brightness, see how it's not moving at all there? It's completely, like, even if we go to the extreme amounts, it moves a tiny bit, but, you know, up until around this point, it's actually held those highlight details much, much better. So it's a really useful tool. So now I've got, you know, my decent exposure that I liked. I haven't lost so much of my highlight detail in the smoke. I'm much happier with that. And that's only a one slider adjustment as opposed to opening up exposure and then having to counteract what I did. Now, if I'm fussy, I might like to bring back down the whites a bit. And you'll see, actually, if we zoom into the smoke here and I just pull the whites all the way down, we've just got that little bit extra in there now. If we do before, after, I like that, that's better. If we do highlights, notice how it actually got darker around here as well. So if I do before, after, just a little smidge darker on that point. And if you look at the histogram now, ignore the picture. So that is before, after. So you see the change in the histogram here. If we do the same with our whites, and now look at the histogram, ignore the picture, before, after, it's just squishing down that top end. It gives us a really nice level of detail here, but doesn't flatten off the image. Janelle, how did he, that's me, get the main window that size and hide the tools? Very easy shortcut to remember. T for tools, B for browser, Apple T, tools back and forth, Apple B, browser back and forth like so. And all I did with the tools is just pull something out from the tool area like so. And again, you could save that as a workspace. So if you wanted to have, you know, a bigger image with just a few tools, save that as a workspace. That's coming, Fernando, don't worry. I've got a very underexposed picture, which we can have a look at in a second. So now we've got, you know, something a bit more of a balance. What else would I do? I would probably open up the shadows a little bit like so and counteract that with the blacks, because what I don't like, if I reset that, I quite like it's almost got a vignette around it, you know, by default, if you like, a nature's vignette. So if I open up the shadows, that kind of loses that a bit. But if I pull the blacks back down, then those darker areas are you know, counteracted. But it doesn't mean I haven't actually seen a bit into the shadows, because if we do before and after, I am actually opening up the shadows a bit, but the blacks before and after still gives me that nice natural vignette. Okay, let's reset my workspace once more. That's better. And then we talk about, okay, so we've kind of balanced this out, and there was a question from the public, which we'll look at in a second, is that the order of doing stuff in. So we'll cover that as well, like how should I edit my pictures, which is yet another controversial subject. Now that we've kind of got base adjustments in, what if I wanted to open up the shadows in individual spots? So let's say I want to open up the detail on his face a little bit. I want to see into his boxer tricks here a little bit as well. Easiest and fastest way to do that is to find your style brushes tool. If we look at built-in style brushes, there's one here called Shadow Recover. So if I grab that, immediately my brush cursor tool has been selected, and as I start brushing, a new layer is created. A number of adjustments are set up on that layer relating to shadow recovery, and then I can start brushing on my picture. So if I want to see in here a little bit, maybe in his B boxer tricks, whatever's going on in there, then I can do so. So now if I zoom in and we turn this layer off and back on again, looks great. So we can see into that detail a little bit more. If you think you've overdone it, we can just pull that opacity slider back a bit and moderate how much we've done without having to, undo adjustments or tweak adjustments or whatever. Handy question there. What are the effects of these sliders on the curves? None whatsoever. So if we look at the curves, they're still flat. I mean, you are kind of doing a curve adjustment in the background, you're just not using the curves. But they are more intelligent than just pulling a curve, because they do some clever stuff under the hood, which gives you, a better outcome where you can balance your picture quite nicely. Now, of course, you can use curves too, but I think playing with these sliders illustrates very nicely exactly what's going on with the histogram. I might just pull in my shadows a tiny bit, and then it just gives me that nice rich stuff going on. All right, how are we doing for questions? You sound as old as me saying Apple instead of Command. Yes, Command, people, not Apple, Command C. I'm sure that annoys Apple as well. Let's check. How did I warm it up? That was just Kelvin slider, but what we could do, don't forget, I'm spoiling what's going to happen in the future, but on your master color balance tab, you could also bring that a little bit to the warm tones as well, if you prefer. Maybe if we make the shadows a bit colder, then that kind of exaggerates it even more. But we'll look at that on another adjustment as well. When do we pick shadow, highlight, recover versus dodge and burn style brushes? Good question, Rick. Let's hold that thought, because we'll talk about that in the next picture. But if we look at our before and after for a second, quite a bit different. But when we think about what we did adjustment wise, there wasn't a great deal going along. Brightness, bit of tweaking with high dynamic range, warmed it up a little bit, opened up the face with a style brush. Now you could decide actually that's too far now, so there's nothing to stop you. I might just bring that brightness down a little bit as well. Again, thinking about the order of which is we're supposed to do something in. You can always go back and adjust and tweak what you're doing. When we come to the next picture, we'll actually talk about the thought process in my head, if that's useful. Matt says, if I wanted to change the brightness or the highlights but using curves, how should I do this and how far can I go? So using curves, let's just say a new variant for a second. So on your curves tool, you can do similar, if not the same things. But if you wanted to lift up the brightness, then we would do that kind of thing. And if we wanted to be careful, you could have a little control point there to bring that down. So you see we've squashed that point a little bit. So that would be kind of opening up the brightness. If you wanted to avoid the shadows, you could pull that one down. Similar to that. Let's reset that. If you wanted to open up the shadows, then we could, do this kind of thing. Opening up the shadows like so. I mean, it can give you more control in the curves because you can shape it exactly on the area of tonal range that you wanted to do. Same with your highlights. If you wanted to recover your highlights, you could bring that one down as well. There's no right or wrong way of choosing the curves or using the sliders. You'll probably find people who've traditionally used Photoshop would dive straight for the curve tool, and there's a lot of powerful stuff you can do with it. I'll point you to a resource at the end about curves, but you know, sliders also do a pretty fab job as well. But curves are really good for like super finite control too. All right, let's move on. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my thread. Okay, let's take this picture and let's talk about the order in which we should do things. Let's reset that so it's back to 0. And the reason why I'm bringing up this question, let's just bring up Safari for a second and bring up a page. So on our support site, support.captureone.com, where you find these live streams here. So this is the one we're talking about at the moment, December 21st. If you scroll down, there is actually a section that you can ask questions. Gus was asking about the balance of shadow, highlight, clarity, sharpening, noise reduction. We'll get into that as well. Joachim was asking about noise reduction and scaling down. So we'll get into that. And I can't remember where it was. Yeah, Richard was asking about when's it the best time to set up my mask, before or after. So kind of a lot of questions on the theme of what order should I do things in. This is my thought process. Yours might be different, but this is mine, and hopefully that might give you some tips. So looking at this picture, the first thing I'm going to do is I can see the camera is pointing up a little bit. Can we actually keystone this slightly? So I'm going to hit auto keystone, see what happens. There we go. So it's just kind of straightened out that door a bit. I'm happy with that. Next, I'm going to crop. So C on my keyboard for crop. I'll decide, do I want these words in? Are they a bit distracting? Let's chop them out like that. So I'm kind of much happier with my crop now. If I was dealing with really bad exposure and I couldn't see what was going on, then I would probably bump up the exposure before cropping, perspective correction, and so on and so forth. But because the exposure on this is okay, you know, I'm happy to just go ahead and start playing around with cropping and so on. I might just rotate that a little bit that way. Okay, happy with that. Next, I will think about my white balance. How's the white balance? Probably all right. Would I prefer it warmer? Quite actually like the cooler tone to it, so I'm going to leave it at that. And then I would get into my baseline settings like exposure, high dynamic range, all that kind of stuff. So the most, or I guess the biggest issue of this picture is down here. So his glove on the right hand side is super, super bright. And you'll find any bright area like that, specular highlight, is really distracting because that's what you tend to go and focus on and look at first. So we want to fix that. His face is also, as being the main subject, is maybe a little bit on the dark side, but I don't mind the exposure of the rest of the image. So maybe I will have to deal with that. But let's think about highlights first. So if I pull down my whites, and you can see the end of the histogram up here, got this kind of big bump on it. So let's pull the whites all the way down, almost fixed, and let's pull the highlights down as well. That's probably as good as it will get. Looking at the RGB numbers, we've got, you know, detail back in there. It's not blown out anymore, but maybe it's a little bit uncomfortably bright, but I don't want to, you know, pull the highlights down too much because I like what's going on here with the light pool. I like what's going on here. I don't necessarily want to mess that up as well. So that's step one. Do I want to open up the shadows? I don't really, because I quite like what's going on here. So I don't really want to touch the shadow slider. It's a little bit maybe on the flat side, so I'd quite like to add a touch of clarity. So now I've dialed in my base adjustments, whatever you want to call them. Now I would think about doing something locally. So the question was, should you set up AI masks or masks in general at the start? I generally don't. I wait to see what's possible just by using normal adjustments, and then I'll dig into the masking side of things. So for him, he's just that little bit too dark. So if we go back to our style brushes, Going to grab my shadows recover. Incidentally, you can set shortcuts for these. So if you find if you're doing bulk work or volume work and you're always using 2 or 3 of the same style brushes, you can set up a shortcut. So if you right click, you can say assign shortcut if you wish. So really super handy. So grabbing my shadows recover, this brush is a bit too big. So I'm going to make that kind of head sized. And it's probably going to take 1, 2 or 3 brush strokes. So if I do that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like so. Now if we turn this layer off and back on, you can see what it's done. If you're worried about any overbrushing, handy shortcut which was added recently, if you hold your Option key down, then it becomes the eraser. So if I just want to clean up around the edges, then I can just do that. But I've still got that little bit of extra light on his face, like so. And down here, if I think I can pull some of this highlights back a bit, if I recover that, so now I've got slightly bigger brush, and I'm just going to brush around his bottom of his t-shirt, like so. Turn this off, back on. That's just tone that down a little bit too. So now if we look at our before and after, whereas before this is really kind of, it has the weight of the picture, this is what you're looking at. Now if we go in this direction, oh, you know, eyes up a bit, we're actually a bit more interested in what's going on with his face, like so. So a couple of little minor adjustments like that can make a big difference. Once again, let's just check on your questions. Quite a complicated one there. Can we have an example of a backlight picture of something that was supposed to be a portrait and how to recover details? I do have something backlit. It's not a portrait, but we can have a look at that in a second. And there was a question about when we should look at, or when should we use the highlight recover as opposed to dodge and burn? Okay, so highlights recover, it's not a mystery what this is doing. If you look at the tools, you can see it's got -100 and -40, and that's pretty much it. There's no curve tweaking going on or anything like that. So it's purely targeted at pulling down the highlights. Okay, if you would use something like dodge brighten, or let's say darken, let's just do a big old darken up here, kind of as a vignette sort of thing going on. And look at what's going on here. You can see, well, that's got a curve, a little exposure tweak. So yeah, it's kind of dropping mid-tone shadows like so. If we do something else, let's do shadows darken, like over here kind of thing, like that. And then we look at what that's doing. That is pulling down the blacks and the shadows like so. So they do have, you know, an overriding different number of adjustments on it. So follow what the name says really. This recovers shadows, this makes shadows darker, this recover highlights. Whereas dodge and burn will be an effect on a broader part of the tonal range. Okay, next picture. Just checking my notes. Yeah, so just in summary, that's kind of, you know, the order to do things. Get your base adjustments in, use masks, style brushes, AI masks, whatever, if you need to, but don't be afraid to go back and tweak and refine if necessary. So now I'm going to bring up this particular image. Let's just reset that like so. So this is how this image came out the camera. Kind of extreme because it was, if we refresh our memory by looking at the metadata, I think 10 to 6 in the morning. Yep, so around 6 in the morning. So my expectation is that it would be perhaps a bit warmer because the sun's coming up. But cameras are never that great at sunrise and sunset because they tend to try and neutralize everything, so we lose some of that warmth. We've got unpleasant highlights here, which is caused by this interior light. We've lost a lot of detail on the beach caused by the headlight, and all of this going to that question from Arvind, you know, a backlit kind of question, but we want detail. How do we go about recovering that? So let's try and tackle those questions. Oh, there was a comment at the start about exposed to the right. Now this is an image where if we looked on the back of our camera and we didn't notice that we had a little bump in our histogram there, we might think, oh, I should probably expose this to the right a little bit more to make sure I get all that shadow detail. Yeah, great, you can do that, but this is all gone now, like if this was as the raw file. So recovering that would have been very difficult. If we remember our beekeeper dude here, if we'd exposed that to the right, if you remember the before looked, let's just get a new variant. So this looked kind of underexposed. So if you exposed it correctly, then you might have lost some of this lovely atmospheric stuff going on at the background. So whilst I understand the principle of exposed to the right, I would say a vast proportion of photographers would get it wrong or miss little tiny details like that. Yes, I appreciate maybe 10 years ago with older sensors that didn't work quite so well for high ISO, weren't quite so good at looking in the shadows. It made a bit more sense to be mindful of trying to get as much data in the shadows as possible. But now on any camera within the past 5 or 6 years or whatever, it's pretty impressive what you can pull out of the shadows in a really nice clean way. And we'll look at some high ISO stuff as well. This is ISO 200, so it's, you know, it's pretty clean. But I would still much rather hang on to these highlights than attempt to get data into the shadows, which I don't really need. Also, another thing about highlights is also be mindful of the ISO you're shooting. So if you're on your fake ISO, and depending on the manufacturer, might be labeled differently, but your native ISO, this is a Fuji X-H2, I think the native is 100. If you go down to 50, then you get a, my Fuji isn't here actually, it must be in the bag. Then you get, I think it's got L next to it. So it's not a real ISO 50 or whatever, it's just a fake ISO 50. And the problem is with shooting at those ISOs is that you lose the ability to recover highlights. So be very mindful if you're on those pseudo ISO values that do not overexpose your highlights, because there's no hope in getting them back at all. All right, so looking at this picture, my thought process once more, so you know what's going on in my brain. I would actually angle this, straighten it a little bit. I like the fact that it's nosing into the beach, but it's maybe too much. Then I would crop it. So if I grab my crop tool, there's a blob here which is distracting, so I'm just going to crop that out and have something a bit more panoramic, like so. So now I'm happy with the crop setup, good. Now we can tackle exposure, contrast, all those things. Again, I wouldn't dare touch exposure because that highlight's just going to disappear. So I might open up my brightness a smidge. Not too much, because the sky looks good. I don't mind it being a little bit dark. It is obviously very early, so making it look fake daytime, that's pointless. That's just boring now. We've got, it could be 9 o'clock in the morning. It's kind of nice to know that this guy's getting up early, going for his morning surf. So I'd open that up a tiny touch. And then highlights shadow wise, if I pull my highlights down, it's actually not bad. That's got a lot of that mess back. And if I pull my whites down, probably around here, we might just be at the limit of what the camera has recorded. If I pull exposure all the way down, you can see even at -4 stops, we can still see this. Again, exposing to the right would have totally messed up this picture. So let's pull that back to 0. Highlights and shadows, yeah. So I'm not gonna really play around with exposure that much. 10 to 6 in the morning, I would expect it to be warmer. So I'm gonna warm that up slightly. And already if we look at our before and after, so before and after, just by manipulating those endpoints, kind of improves a lot. In some ways, I don't mind that it's really bright, because if you were sat on there on the beach looking at this, if you flatten everything off into a horrible kind of fake HDR look, it just doesn't look very realistic. So the fact that it's maybe a little bit bright is actually fine. But for the sake of authenticity, I'll bring that down a bit as well. This looks much better. He looks much better. but we could probably do a little bit of work opening up, you know, the shadows and so on. The fact that it's red down here doesn't bother me because that's spinning over from his brake lights, I would imagine, so that's not weird white balance or anything like that. So pretty good otherwise. Probably have to be a bit careful of, so if I turn on my exposure warning, you can just see where we're going out of range on the shadows, so it's absolutely fine. Okay, so if I open up my shadows a touch, see, I don't really want to do that because it affects the whole picture. So we're going to deal with that in a separate way. So first of all, if we grab our shadows recover, I'm going to make this bigger. We've got a nice low flow by default on this style brush, which means that when we brush back and forth, we're building up our adjustment nice and slowly and gradually, much like a very dry paintbrush. So if I think on the side of the car here, I'm just going to do a little quick brush back and forth. Probably do a little bit more. Oh, bit too much. So let's do a little bit more there, and then we can take the opacity down a touch. So maybe on the wheels, let's go round in circles on the wheels, round in circles on the wheels. And what do we think? So that was before and after. So at this point, it's not actually bad. I'll probably just take the opacity down a bit to make it look a lot more natural, but I much prefer just opening up the side here, much like Arvin, your backlit portrait scenario. If it's really bright in the background but the portrait is dark, then use some kind of local adjustment to brighten that up. But I much prefer that to the effect of brightening up the whole picture, just kind of loses all the atmosphere. But it's kind of weird to have that super dark, so it makes sense if we can just open that up a little bit. So I might just do a swipe along the windows, one more. You can always take the flow down even more if you want to be super mindful of it, and just a little bit under the bottom. So you're kind of painting with light dodging and burning almost. But if we turn those shadows off and back on, yeah, I find that a lot more sympathetic. Now for him, we could probably do the same. So if I make my brush smaller and just kind of brush down the length of his outfit. Remember, at this such low flow, you're not going to necessarily think anything is happening as you're doing it. But if we zoom in, look at his jacket, turn off shadows once more, before and after. So we can just see a little bit more into it. I might have overbrushed there. Let's have a look. Yeah, so that looks a little bit weird. So what we're going to do now is take our minus, going to make this a bit smaller, hold down Option on my keyboard, and then we're just going to take out what we did there. And then this is going to be the same flow as it was earlier, so it's going to take, you know, a few brush strokes to kind of get that back to some semblance of how it was before, like so. So that's better, that's got rid of that. There's nothing worse than seeing a weird halo around something like a sky or something like this. Finally, for highlights, if we grab our highlight brush again, highlights recover, can we get anything back over here? I don't know. So if I just do a bunch of brushing back and forth, maybe on the tail light here, we're probably out the bounds of what the camera has. So if I do highlights recover, yeah, we've got a little bit back. I think here, right on the brightest part, this is being lit by, you know, the interior lights and this one up here. So we're not going to get a great deal back on that, but it's not distracting. It's way better than it was, I think, before, after. So that's how we started. And really where your eyes want to look is here and the headlights, which is not great. If we come back to that, that's just a lot more balanced and nicer overall. Sometimes we can go a bit too far, possibly. So I might just add a teeny bit of contrast, just a few points. Maybe not even that, just a few. All right, how are we doing for time? Oh, we're good, actually. We can talk about noise in a second. Let's just take a little question break. Question there on, yeah, Mike Nelson talking about exposure to the right. Has always been to expose as brightly as possible without blowing out highlights. I agree, but I've seen way too many cases where people think they have exposed to the right and not blown out the highlights and absolutely done so. So I think if you get obsessive about exposing to the right and not watching that histogram like a hawk, you're in danger of losing the highlights. And once you've lost those, that's it, they're gone. Whereas at least on an image like this with pretty dark shadows, we've got loads of recovery potential. If I just zoom in, like buckets of potential, and I haven't even scratched the surface yet. We could see deeper into there if we wanted to, but I don't want to, because then it's just, you know, ruining the atmosphere. So whilst I completely agree with you, Mike, that the theory is to expose to the right without blowing out the highlights, you've just got to be really diligent in doing that. And I think if you spend too much time focusing on that and not actually making a nice picture, then it suffers. And there's just so much flexibility in that raw file, I even wonder if it's worth the stress. So yeah, once you hit 255, you've got no data to work with. Exactly. So you need to just be really careful on that. Do you recommend using linear curve in the base characteristics? Possibly. So if we say, what am I looking for? New variant. Like so, what Kenneth is talking about is not there. Where have I put mine? Here. So here we've got curve, you've got linear response. And what that does is flatten everything off. So you get a much flatter starting point. You might have the ability to recover more shadow detail, highlight detail, and so on, but you will need to put the work in to actually get the end contrast result you want. So I would never recommend having that switched on by default, because you're just creating work for yourself. But if you find you have an image which you're struggling with, you can't seem to get the dynamic range out of it, then by all means switch to the linear curve and try that, but don't put it on as a default. Can David show an example of making adjustments to a JPEG? I'm curious to see the limitations. Tons of limitations. Like when it comes to shadows and highlight recovery, like if this was a JPEG, forget about it. I mean, it would just look horrific as a JPEG. You would get cross colors, the shadows would not look nice, you would not be able to recover highlights. Playing with the white balance skews it all over the place. If you want to try it, James, take one of your raw files, export it as a JPEG, like start from your base like this, export that as a JPEG, bring it into Capture One and try and do it, and then you'll never attempt to do that again because it's hopeless pretty much. A JPEG is fine if it's well exposed and doesn't have, you know, any extremes. You can do, you know, a reasonable amount to it, but if you have to really work the image, then you're going to hit a wall with the JPEG very, very quickly, unfortunately. So yeah, I would not recommend doing that, definitely not. All right, let's talk about noise, as that's always a popular subject. So let's take this picture as an example. Black and white. There was a question this morning, how do the highlight and shadow whites, black sliders work in relation to a black and white picture? Absolutely no different whatsoever. So similar kind of theory, really. So I shouldn't worry about the difference too much. It really does behave in much the same way. So don't get too obsessed with that. What I wanted to do to show you this picture was to show you it actually began life as that. So pretty underexposed. This is ISO 10,000, so very high ISO, totally underexposed. I mean, when you reach that level of underexposure and ISO, you're in danger of, you know, ruining color response and all kinds of things. But if you get a picture like that, don't gloss by it and think, oh my God, I've ruined it, because you can actually get pretty nice pictures out of it. I'd be dead chuffed if that was a picture from my wedding. What a nice, you know, candid picture. But that's how it started. And we didn't do a great deal to it in terms of adjustment. But if we just bring up the exposure massively for a start and a bit of brightness too, you can see, you know, color wise, what you'll find is if it's something as underexposed and as noisy as that, then the Kelvin slider becomes really sort of sensitive. So small movements become quite tricky. We could try auto on that. Yeah, see, auto, we could try picking his shirt. Yeah, so we get to something like that. Anyway, just auto level that. The other thing you'll find with higher ISO shots, and this is always a good raw converter test, is how do the colors look? Because when we're dealing with, you know, that little information, it gets really difficult from a raw conversion side of things to deal with getting the nicest colors. So if we, sorry to this lovely guest here, but then, you know, we can see like color tone shifts in her skin and that kind of stuff. But what I did want to talk about in particular was noise reduction. So if we zoom into his suit, that's always a telltale giveaway, and look at the noise reduction tool. So how noise reduction works in Capture One is that you always start off with 50-50-50. There might be different stuff going on under the hood. So even though it's always 50-50-50, under the hood we might do some other tweaks depending on the noise, the camera model and so on. We can also see here for this particular camera, and Jason was asking what it is, I'll have a look in a minute. For this particular camera we decided at this ISO we need some single pixel adjustment. What is that? If we just dial that down to 0. So if you see all these little messy pixels here, it just gets rid of those. So false color, false readouts. Again, when we get to, you know, that level of underexposure, we don't have a lot to work with on a raw conversion side of things. So single pixel will just dial out any of those nasty false pixels. Luminance will get rid of, you know, luminance, just that general noise, and then color will clean up. So if you see that color noise on his jacket, if we turn that to 0, loads of color noise. If we increase that, then we slowly kind of remove that color noise and so forth and clean that up a little bit. So that's what those sliders do. Also, when it comes to noise, I think it's really important to think about what's the use of this picture. Am I just going to put it out on Instagram at 1080 pixels and never do anything else? Fabulous. Don't worry about the noise so much then, because you're not going to see it. Am I going to print this out 1 meter across and hang it above my fireplace? Then yes, I would be then hyperfocal, hyper serious on reducing the noise as much as possible. Camera wise, I think this was a Panasonic, if memory serves me correct. Panasonic Lumix S, so that'd be the S1, as I think, S1 Mark 1, because this was shot 2019. So yeah, so that would be the S1 Mark 1. I mean, to be fair, at 10,000 ISO at that exposure, it's done bloody well actually. Like, imagine trying to recover that out of, you know, pick any Canon, Nikon or whatever from 10 years ago, then this would have been a trash photo. So it just shows, you know, how good modern cameras, and that's not even that modern. So all right, what was I going to talk about next? Yeah, so if we go back to just talking about the intended use of this picture. So if we go back to this one that we edited, this is ISO 1250. So it's got a bit of noise in it, and we're looking at 100% for the purpose of live stream. Whoops. Try not to delete the picture, David. For the purpose of live streams, let's zoom in a little bit more. So we're at, what are we at? 300%, and we can see there's some noise here for sure. So would I go ahead and start trying to reduce that? Again, it would depend on my output. So if we say export, and we're going to go to a Instagram optimized JPEG, which is going to look this big at 1080 pixels across. Should I be biting my nails and thinking, ooh, I really need to, you know, reduce the noise a little bit? Absolutely not, because you're going to reduce it in size, that alone will help reduce any noise reduction that you have. I would be mindful if it was super noisy into not adding too much output sharpening. If you look in our archive of former live streams, there's one called Sharpen Up, comedy name, which talks about sharpening in a lot more detail and where you can sharpen in 3 different stages across Capture One. So in our output sharpening, if you have a very noisy picture, I would just be mindful maybe to keep that on the lower end. I would also be mindful perhaps to not using excessive amounts of structure. Because if we just throw in loads of structure here, a ridiculous amount, you can start to antagonize the noise. But there, again, would be nothing wrong with adding a bit of structure in this picture. It cleans up his face quite nicely. When it comes to sharpening and noise reduction, you can also consider applying them locally. So making a mask and just applying sharpening to an area, or noise reduction to an area. For example, if you've got a person, a bird, or whatever on an out of focus background, there's no point applying loads of sharpening to that background, but it might be valid to apply sharpening to the subject. So just be mindful of the intended use and output, mindful of can I handle sharpening and noise reductions on layers, often the best result, and then using those sliders to bring that down as much as possible. But for this particular shot, would I mess around with the noise any further? Unlikely, unless I was going to print it big and wanted to maximize the quality. What was David P's question, which someone said they were upvoting? Would you be better to just target the very underexposed areas for noise reduction rather than a blanket change for the whole image? Yeah, for sure. And also depending, like, that's not noisy, so that's not a good example. 1 second. I can't remember the photographer's name, Andy, I think this is it. It's a cool shot. Like this dude, this little guy. I don't think it's, but imagine this was super noisy background. I mean, you can see a tiny bit, but it's nothing I would worry about. So on the background, I would possibly, so this is a background mask, I hope, yes. So on our background mask, I would happily put more noise reduction in. I would probably take out any sharpening. So we've got no sharpening on this background, but we can add in some extra noise reduction. And I would be quite aggressive of that because there's no detail that I'm getting rid of. I would just end up with a nice, super smooth, noise-free background. On my subject, so hopefully this is the subject. Yep. On my subject, I would have my standard noise reduction. So on my background, we've got our standard noise reduction. On my subject, I wouldn't feel the need to add any more because you can't see any noise. I'm at 300% by the way. So we can't see any noise because of the structure of the feathers and all that kind of stuff. But I would probably then be thinking about adding more sharpening to that. Look, if I go super aggressive, you can see we're just sharpening the subject. And then on my image layer, I would have sharpening at 0. So the whole image has no sharpening on it, but on my subject mask, we could add the sharpening as we see fit. And on my background, I would go, super crazy with the noise reduction. So we get a nice smooth background, but it's not affecting that. So by taking those steps, we could print this up really nice and you'd have a super smooth background with no noise, grain structure. You wouldn't see it on the subject anyway. So there's no point dialing up loads of noise reduction there. So I hope Amari and David P, that answers your question. You can always deal with noise and sharpening in those different ways. Is that a new type? It's not a new type, but what we were talking about was handling noise and sharpening on different masks like so. So if you go back to our AI masking live stream, then I'm pretty sure I talk about this actual edit in detail. So that would be my suggestion if you want to know more about that. Did we finish our noise convo? Oh yeah, here we go. Here's another, ISO 8000. This is on a Nikon D8. No, it's not. It's a Sony A7 Mark III. My mistake. So this is a camera from 2021. Camera nerds. Was that a good guess? Because we're at the A7 Mark IV now in 2024. So this is probably, yeah, 3 or so years old. We have decided that at ISO 8000, an A7 Mark III potentially has some single pixel issues, so by default we've put in 20 points of single pixel. Now I think I looked at this image earlier and I couldn't actually find any. If we look at the dogs, no, it's pretty clean. So even if I was printing this one relatively big, none of that, you know, noise structure is particularly offensive, and I'm at 300% there and I can't see, you know, anything worth worrying about. So I'd say don't obsess with your high ISO images unless there is a good reason, really printing it big as an example, that you want to be hyper focused on reducing that noise. All right, I think we are nearly at the end and we've only got 5 minutes to go. So, oh, don't forget, you know, if you want to maximize your HDR kind of things, there is the HDR tool. So there's one I made earlier, but if we take the, let's just reset all of these. If we look at the exposure compensation down here, so this was at 0, this is -2, this is, that's also -2, this one is +2. So if I take 0, this one, and right click and say merge to HDR, I'm going to auto adjust and auto align them, merge those together. And the benefit of doing an HDR merge for something as extreme as this is that you will get cleaner shadows. So once this guy finishes merging, I could have just opened them when I'd done earlier, but there we go. Let's open this one up. So there's my resulting DNG. It's been auto adjusted. So it's already got some adjustments in highlight shadows. That's actually not bad from the outset. I'd probably pull my highlights down a little bit more, but it just means in our shadows, if we open up, you know, they're nice and clean. We got lots of detail, etc. Can anyone guess what this cave is called as a joke? It's not the proper Icelandic name, but you might be able to guess what its nickname is. But if we look at our kind of normalish exposure one, let's take that one. So what's this shot at? This is, yeah, +2. I mean, we've lost our highlights there pretty much, and the cave has got some nice details in it. But if we go to one where we've got, you know, nice highlight details, and then we try and look into the cave, then it just starts to get a bit noisy and messy and so on. Still not bad, to be honest. As I said, cameras are getting better and better, but if you want to maximize quality, then an HDR blend, of course, helps as well. Yoda Cave points to JD. Exactly, it does look a bit Yodery. The only thing I screwed up here was that there was this person walking across on a deserted, enormous beach. Someone messed up my shot, but it's easy enough to retouch that out. All right, reminder of upcoming live streams. So let's go back to live stream. So I've just this morning put up a couple of new ones for January 11th and 18th. It's not the same webinar. I just mistakenly got a bit mixed up with sample images and submitted that to our creative team to use for January 11th. But I'm not going to go and edit the same pictures all over again. What is important on this page, you can say follow. And then that will give you an email notification when that goes out. To give you an easy way to remember that, you can either scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, or you can just remember that short URL, c1_livestreams on bit.ly, and then that will take you to the same place as well. Nice. Last couple of questions. Yeah, Rick was asking, I think I mentioned it briefly, Rick, does upscaling or downscaling an image affect noise? Yeah, downscaling it, you're going to reduce it. Upscaling it, I don't know actually. I haven't tried upscaling it for a while. It might also reduce it, might make it worse, but definitely downscaling it will reduce it. We had a few questions about last week's live stream, which was a bust, unfortunately, because of internet issues. As I explained there, Zoe's going to pre-record some content, which he's currently in the middle of. And then in the new year, I would think now, because I don't suppose anybody is going to be watching YouTube next week or the week after. In the new year, we'll arrange a time to broadcast that, and I'll invite everyone back as well. So I've got a list of who signed up for that. So you will be the first to know when that transmission is ready. So sorry we couldn't bring it to you live last week. So hopefully that was useful for everybody. You know, it's all about controlling those tricky highlights and shadows with sliders or curves or whatever. If you want to know more about curves, oh, that's what I was going to show you. If you scroll down, so how to use AI masking, check out that live stream. There is a section in there about sharpening and noise reduction, keeping them, you know, separate. If you scroll down even further, there's one about sharpening as well, which also talks about keeping sharpening and noise reduction separate as far as I can remember. So that page is really important reference for everyone. But as I said, it's just about controlling those endpoints. Remember what you can do with exposure versus brightness. Remember what each of these do. And then kind of when you hit the limits of working on the base of an image, then you move to your local adjustments. Style brushes are by far the fastest way to do it. So thanks for joining me today. Enjoy your breaks. Hopefully everyone's off work from tomorrow, or at least Saturday, and not thinking about it until next year. So see you in 2024. Take care and have a good one. See ya. Bye.